Hi everyone, welcome to the MBN Boston Data Podcast. Today we're joined by Harry Davies, VP of Marketing Investment and Effectiveness at Sage. From shaping government behaviour campaigns to scaling ads at Amazon to leading data science and analytics teams at Google and now driving marketing strategy and investment at Sage, Harry's seen firsthand what makes data marketing work and what doesn't. By the end of the episode, you'll understand how B2B effectiveness differs from B2C, how to align sales and marketing, the shifts in customer behaviour you need to watch, and how AI is set to transform the way we measure impact. Harry, welcome. Really glad to have you on board today. We've been talking for a long time about getting this podcast together, so it's been about a year or so, which is always good. Finally, we managed to do it on a Friday, which is always fun as well. I'd like to talk to you quickly about your journey before we kick off, if that's okay. So I want to touch upon your career to date. You've had a really fascinating career within government, Google, Amazon, and obviously now Sage. Would you be able to walk us through that?
Sure. So sometimes I think I've done my career in reverse. I started off in local government and then I moved into the civil service. And joining the civil service was fascinating because we were running all of the campaigns during the Blair government, all of the behaviour change campaigns. And that went from forces recruitment all the way through to Change for Life, which was helping people to challenge the obesity crisis. So it's really broad, interesting area. But it really, because we were spending government money or taxpayers' money, we had to really show the return that the taxpayer was getting. So we really had to prove the effectiveness. So I learned through that role all about like how you design behavior change campaigns, also how you use behavioral economics, which was a new thing to me back then. It was 20 odd years ago. And then probably more important in what shaped the rest of my career, I learned about media mix modeling or econometrics and using that to understand really quite difficult to measure things. Things like, are we having an impact on getting people to stop smoking through showing an ad on a website? That's a really difficult problem. It's not, did someone click on this ad and buy a product? Did someone see this ad, think about their life, change a deep-rooted behavior that perhaps is part of their culture? No, it's a huge, big thing to unpick, and really learning how econometrics can answer that was what I got from that. Then I joined Google, and I remember my first week at Google, we went to an all hands and they kept on talking about these are our quarterly targets. And I walked out and I thought, what the hell's a quarter? And after a while, I worked out it was a quarter of a year. And then I was like, 3 months. I used to work on 3 to 5 year campaigns. How on earth am I going to do anything in 3 months? I think I might be able to generate a document in 3 months. And so that kind of pace of change really, for my own career, I really learned how to operate much faster, to really focus on what was important. But more importantly, for the thing that I love, which is understanding how you can measure influencing people, really understanding how to research and how to measure digital signals. So what people are doing online and how that can give you predictors of how they're going to behave in the real world was really what I got fascinated by. And I think this is quite symptomatic of my career. At Google, I was doing the same thing over and over again. I was like getting better and better at how to help agencies predominantly measure advertising, how to influence sales teams to do things differently. But I got a little bit bored, so I thought, okay, I need to change something. And the change that I made was I moved to Amazon. And Amazon was probably where I would like to have started my career, because at that time they would hire for 110% of the work, one person. So there was always too much work to do. And they did that purposefully to get you to make choices, to really focus on what was important. And that really then led me down this route of data-driven marketing, because we were launching a search advertising product across Europe. And that really allowed me to dive deep into, okay, we need to understand exactly what's going on. Why has it gone up? We need to be able to explain that. Why has it gone down from last week? We need to be able to explain that on a line-by-line basis on every single line of our report. So really being able to analyze data very quickly and focus became a really important skill there. Whilst I enjoyed the people and I enjoyed the work at Amazon, I don't think it was the right culture for me. And I ended up going back to Google and running the measurement and analytics team. And this is probably probably the job in my career that I've got most affection for, because I was going out, the team were going out every single week to different businesses and trying to help them measure the effectiveness of their digital advertising spend. And so that one week we'd be talking to a supermarket. The next week we might be talking to a mobile phone company. The next week we might be talking to a travel company. And so having to very quickly understand their business, understand what metrics were most important to them, and then work out what's the measurement method best to use to answer the questions that they've got. It was really fascinating. And I think to accelerate the learning, that consulting was really helpful, because I suddenly learned about all kinds of different business models and all kinds of different ways of understanding whether it was working. Every single week was a different challenge, and I really enjoyed that. But ultimately, I thought it's all very well telling people how to do this stuff. Maybe I should try doing it myself. And that's when I moved to Sage. I moved to Sage and set up the effectiveness team. That's where I am now. And that sort of that movement from measurement and effectiveness, I'm now making the transition into strategy, which is really fascinating as well. I think one common thread is I'm not happy unless I'm learning something new. Like, I want to be wrong most of the time so that I can learn something new. So constantly trying to find places where I'm wrong to then learn something is important.
Do you think working initially in government helped make you patient? Is it tempered expectations slightly when you do go into organisations that want things fast? Was it a benefit, or did it arm you with the tools you needed to go, okay, we need to slow down here, we need to strategize a bit more, plan ahead? And is that sort of the capacity it was a benefit, or do you think it could have been a bit of a double-edged sword?
I think there are benefits and there are problems as well. So one of the problems is when I was first in the civil service, I was in a government department, and I'd work on projects, and then we'd get a ministerial change, and then that project would disappear. So quite a lot of work would just never see the light of day. That was quite depressing. When I moved to the Central Office of Information, it's no longer there. Everything that came through our door had already been signed off, so it was going to happen. So that was good. What was very helpful about it is that you're trying to influence things that are very difficult to measure. And so that gave light to a way of thinking that's different, that isn't looking for what's the obvious thing I can count. And so understanding correlation, understanding tools like econometrics became really important, because it was the only way we could understand whether things were working or not, because the real life behavior change was so far away from the communications. So I think that was really helpful. I think the fast pace of somewhere like Amazon cuts through a lot of politics, like small p politics. And I think had I learned those skills before going into work in the civil service, I would have been more effective. So I think there are real positives to it, and you get to work on some really fascinating challenges, but that pace is difficult, or was difficult. That's 20 years ago now, so I suspect it's changed.
I think it is a common thread here is from government to private. I wanted to make the contrast as well too between B2B and B2C. I often hear what works in B2C won't work in B2B. I'm not too sure if that's true or not. I'm keen to find out what your take is on that. Are there fundamental principles that carry across to both, or is it entirely a different playbook?
So if you step right back and look at a macro level, there's a lot of similarities. Ultimately, you need to get your product or service in front of range of potential buyers, and you need to build a memory of your service, your company, or your product, so that when they are buying your category, when they actually come into market, then they think of you first. And then you then need to convert them. And so ultimately, that's what you need to do, whether you're selling a car, a piece of software, a bottle of milk. However, when you get down into the actual tactics for doing that, there are a lot of differences. So if you think about mid-sized businesses, so maybe 20 to 400, 500 employees, that sort of size business, you're likely to have a few people that are making the decision. You're not going to have one person that walks into a shop and buys your piece of software. Like, they're going to be doing some research, they're going to be thinking about various different things, and they are going to sometimes be forced through a process through people like procurement. And that means that they are going to buy in a different way. There's going to be differences. You still need to make sure that when they're not in market, you're building that memory structure so they think of you. But if they are buying your product, like if they're buying staples, you don't need to build a very long-term memory, because you just have to repeat telling them, and they'll think they're buying staples every day, and they'll start just buying them every day. But if you're selling something that maybe they don't buy for 10 years, then then you need to build that memory on a regular basis. You might need to reach that group of people once every quarter just to remind them that you exist. And you need to remind them that you exist in a couple of ways. One, you need to remind them that you exist as a company, but you also need to remind them what you do, whether that's a product or a service, and you need to remind them in a space when they're thinking about that kind of work. So LinkedIn is a really good place to be, because people are generally thinking about work when they're on LinkedIn. But you need to think about what's the environment that will remind people of my category. So if that's finance software, like we sell at Sage, you need to think, what's the environment where they are going to be thinking about finance in general? How do we reach them in that point? And then make sure that you reach them on a regular basis to have that memory, so that if they happen to come into market, or you even nudge them into market, rare but possible, they are thinking about you first. And that's really important, because generally what we see with B2B buyers is that they often buy from the first person they think about, and they've normally got a short list of companies they want to work with from day one in their buying journey. So having that memory is really important. Once they come into market, you need to then make sure that you help them make the purchase. So what are the bits of information they need? Now, we often think about very linear journeys within business to business marketing, but in reality, nobody goes on a linear journey. We might say, okay, we'll send them 3 emails, and the first email is going to be telling them about how we accelerate their team. The second email is going to be talking about the features that enable that. And then the third email is going to be talking about how you get into contact with a sales rep. In reality, how many people will open all 3 emails? Will you reach all of the audience? They'll just come and go. There's a lot of randomness within that buying journey that we don't like to admit as marketers. But in reality, they're bouncing around all over the place, getting information from all kinds of places. And so it is very different, because you've got a different way of buying. So when you get down to the tactics that you use and how you think about it, it's different. From a macro level, it's very similar. And then also your approach to competition is very different. If you are a challenger and you're going up against a really big player in the market, they're going to be outspending you. So you can't use the same tactics as them, because you'll just lose. So then you need to start thinking about, do we find some white space where our competitors aren't playing and our product is better than our competitors for that particular group of people? Let's focus on that. Let's win that and then move on to the next one. So you want to find chunks of audience that are big enough to be worthwhile, but small enough for you to go slightly around the side of your competitors. So there's a lot of different tactics when you get into the details, but there's a lot of commonality as well. And I think it's interesting that there's a lot of noise about what B2B can learn from B2C, but actually, having worked on both, I think there's probably quite a lot that we could learn from B2B and apply to B2C as well.
From my perspective, in talent, used to be very black and white. My approach when it came to this, a comparison would be treat every client as a candidate and every candidate as a client. That's simple. But the subtleties, like you said, there's so many variables that you can't really be black and white in this approach. And I completely agree. And I can see some parallels there between what we do in the market as a boutique agency compared to some of the larger ones where we found the white space, like you say, and added value there. It's a grey area. And I think you're right. You can take one from another, but it's not always mutually inclusive. So that's interesting. My next question to you is, again, it's another dichotomy, and it's something that sees a lot of tension as well too. Tension might be the wrong word, but the differences in opinion is sales and marketing alignment. It's like the classic sales and marketing seem to always have issues getting along. So one of the biggest challenges in B2B, from what we've seen, is classic sales versus marketing tension. And at a company like Sage, where sales and marketing do coexist, how do you align these teams to maximize overall go-to-market effectiveness?
Yeah, so that's a massive journey. And it's like I did some research on it a few years ago in a previous role when I was at Google. And it was interesting. I interviewed a bunch of people that had operated different models. What seemed to be, and this is a few years ago now, and it will change. What seemed to be different is the gold standard for driving sales and marketing alignment is thinking about it as a commercial unit or as a go-to-market motion. Some people that use media, email, and this is very much on the go-to-market. It's not the full marketing. It's just on the kind of, okay, how are you driving your sales? Very much thinking, right, there's people that will be using the tools like email, media, webinars, content. And then there's people that will be using the telephone and meetings. And some people will be incentivized over a year period, so slightly longer term, and some people will be incentivized for a shorter 3-month period. Everybody's trying to do the same thing. We're trying to align on closed won opportunities. It's just some people are using different tools over a longer period. They look more like marketers, and salespeople look focused very much on the short term using meetings and calls. That, I think, is the gold standard, but that's a journey. Getting to that kind of overall how we go to market motion unit that encompasses marketing, sales, customer success, and flowing that all the way through takes a while to get to, and we're definitely not fully there at Sage. I think the first thing to do is align on kind of key metrics that you care about. And really, those key metrics should be closed won deals, because ultimately that's the thing that puts money in the bank. And that means that, like traditional B2B marketing, you'd say marketers generate marketing qualified leads. They give those to salespeople. Those salespeople phone them up. They turn them into opportunities and they work them through a sales pipeline and then they close them. But that then means that the marketers are incentivized for volume of MQLs and not worried about the quality. And they're not also worried about how those individuals, which are what an MQL is, a marketing qualified lead, is just a person that works for a company. They're not interested in how that's progressing through the pipeline, or they're not incentivized. If you start thinking about closed won opportunities or deals, then the marketer cares about the quality of the people that they're bringing in. They're making sure they're from the right businesses. They're then making sure that they're doing things to protect that opportunity as it moves through the pipeline. So perhaps they're getting different messaging when they're in the pipeline from when they were before they were in the pipeline. So that way, if you're aligning on those key metrics and you're incentivizing based on those key metrics, then you can drive alignment. And that's very much how account-based marketing works. Marketing and sales need to change their behavior and work much more as a unified go-to-market team as opposed to just a sales team and a marketing team.
As a sales director, I've found having a marketing team who can almost become a sales enablement team and a conduit between those two as a separate entity almost is super useful. And it's naturally as well too, as a salesperson, like I'm just not a good marketeer. I don't know. You think you would be in talent, but it's just it's chalk and cheese. There are good people who do it. There's loads of people in the industry that do it well, but I think fundamentally it's a different discipline, and I'd be silly to say I could do someone else's job. So I think there needs to be more collaboration in that environment, especially in the talent space anyway. But like moving forward quickly, I want to go into a bit more technical depth right now in terms of your background as a measurement specialist. Could you share some concrete examples of how you've connected online marketing to offline business results? So something that shows how measurement actually works in the real world.
Sure. So I'll talk about a couple of examples. So one using experiment. So this was back when I used to work for Google. We were working with Waitrose. We went into Waitrose and we had a chat with them, and we were talking to the digital team. The digital team were doing online advertising to drive online sales. And we're like, yeah, but don't you care about the in-store sales? And they weren't actually incentivized at the time for in-store sales. And we're like, but we're pretty sure that there's going to be, like, people are going to search online, see that they can get Razen 2 in Waitrose, and then they're going to go to Waitrose and get that ingredient. And they'll probably pick up some other things at the same time. Like, that's going to happen. And they were like, yeah, but we found it really difficult to show that. And so we worked with them to design a set of experiments where we broke the country up into different regions. Google has created marketing areas across the UK so that you're able to split the UK into different chunks. We then looked at their sales data for each of those areas and then created pairings of those different areas so they had similar sales. And then essentially we flipped a coin between each of those and that stratified list of areas, and we put, I think it was a 50-50 test. We put 50% test into test and 50% into control, and we were looking at both online sales and offline sales from those areas. That's the variable that we cared about. We then ran the test and we were able to show them that whilst they'd pretty much reached the maximum online sales they were going to get from online advertising, they had still some opportunity and they were driving a significant amount of in-store sales. So they'd reached saturation on online advertising for online sales, but they hadn't reached that saturation for offline sales. And they were able to take that to their board to say, look, our online advertising is driving in-store sales, and we can drive even more in-store sales if we really focus on that. It was a fascinating project because we were working directly with the data science team. We had to expose them. Luckily, the methodology we used was open sourced, so we were able to give them that methodology, and so they could run the experiment, shadow our experiment, and they could run the analysis themselves to see whether they validated it. But that had quite a significant impact in how they thought about online advertising and even how they thought about targeting teams in terms of retail sales. So that was a really fascinating example. And we used to run a lot of those experiments at Google. And there's an open source R package. They probably made it available on Python as well now. So if you do a search for geo experiments Google, you can find that very easily. And it's very easy to run. You need to know a little bit of R or a little bit of Python, but not a great deal. Then one of the other projects that I'll talk about is when we first ran econometrics at Sage. So when I first joined, we were working with a small company to bring econometrics into Sage, and we started with a kind of proof of concept on the UK business. We managed to get the data. It took a long time to get the data, but it exposed a lot of long term. Econometrics is pretty good for short term, but short term is maybe a year or 2 years for econometrics. But we were able to show that some of the channels that had previously been discounted, that are broader reach channels in the UK, were actually having quite a significant impact. We were also able to show the impact that policy changes had. So one of the things that happened in the UK was that the government introduced a thing called Making Tax Digital. There's another wave of it next year. So sole traders and landlords will be getting involved in quarterly returns and having to do digital accounting. But when they first did it, it was for VAT registered businesses, I think over 70 grand or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But we could see this huge bump of sales that was driven directly from that policy change, because suddenly people needed to get accounting software. They needed to move away from Excel and pen and paper. And so suddenly a load more opportunity came into the market that we then picked up. So we started to understand not just what are the different channels doing, but what are the base sales that we're getting and what happens when we get policy changes. So we were able to give that visibility, not just which channels were working, but also the impact of things like government policy changes and what happened around those. Started to get into some competitive insight as well, which we developed later. And I think probably, and we might come on to this a little bit more, that kind of blending the different approaches of things like attribution, experiments, and media mix modeling is really important, because no one of them is 100%, but if you're using all of them, you get closer and closer to the right answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. It takes me on to the next question as well too. It's probably a good segue into customer insight, customer brand behavior, customer loyalty. I think over the years, I don't know about you, and this is probably subjective, I definitely think it is, but I don't personally have a brand I would go to and continuously go to now anymore in terms of customer behavior and how you're loyal to a certain brand. There's a few. I know you're a mountaineer. I know you've heard the brand Arc'teryx. That's probably the only brand I'm really avid about over the years, probably bizarrely avid about. I'll buy anything Arc'teryx. And then recently I saw that they partnered with JD Sports, and you're like, oh, that could be like a dip there in quality and stuff like that. And that could turn off a customer. It really could. There could be certain questions asked there around that sort of behavior. And I'll get to the point, but my question to you is, have you seen customer behavior change at all within a B2B environment? I certainly think I have anyway, just from an outside perspective. But how should marketeers adapt if they want to stay relevant in this current climate?
It goes back to that kind of how you approach the overall go-to-market, because what we're seeing, and there's some very recent research from a company called Sixth Sense that shows this really clearly, their B2B buying behavior research, but also from Forrester, from Gartner, from BCG, that literally all of the evidence is pointing that customers or B2B customers are talking to salespeople later and later in their buying cycle. Now, if you think about what used to happen 20, 30 years ago, is you might discover a problem at work that you need to solve. Right? Hang on, if I give a sort of example of why a lot of people move to some of our products, a finance team might be thinking, hang on a second, we're literally spending 3 weeks every month closing the previous month, and then we do it again, and then we do it again. We're spending so much time getting our monthly close right. 20, 30 years ago, if that was a problem, you'd be like, okay, maybe we need to talk to some software vendors about this. And then your first job would be, right, I'm going to phone up some software vendors to talk to them, because you couldn't find the information. Now, your first step might be to do a Google search or to ask ChatGPT, how do I accelerate my close? And then you'll get some information, and that might point to an article on G2 that compares different things. You might download a Forrester Magic Quadrant and go, what are the best players and what are their services? And so by the time you're ready, you've got the information. And so by the time you talk to a salesperson, you've already made the selection. And what you're wanting to do there is validate the selection. Now, building the memory so that you're on that list to start with is still really important. That kind of brand, they call it mental availability, but basically building a memory so that when someone goes, oh, I've got a problem, Sage has done some stuff on that, I'm going to search for Sage. That's really important. So that kind of, when someone's not in market, building that memory is really important. The next step was activation work or demand generation or demand capture work. Now, a lot of that is click here to get this white paper. Click here to talk to a salesperson. That's too short. Because people are in that selection phase, marketers then need to be thinking about what was the process that a salesperson would be taking someone through to build that selection, to influence the selection and make sure that you're seen favorably within that selection. Now, marketers need to think like that. What I'd recommend marketers do is go and talk to the sales leaders and say, what sales methodology do you use? Okay, you're using Challenger or Spin, or there's all these different sales methodologies. And then you go, okay, let's have a look at that sales methodology and let's work out what bits of that can we do at scale that we can do on the website with content syndication on some of these third parties. Make sure that we've got comparison tables so that when someone asks ChatGPT has learned that information from your website, from Reddit, from Wikipedia, getting that into the right places, influencing the sources for those different things. And so that way you then make sure that some of that sales process happens at scale by the marketing team. I'll give you an example of how it doesn't work right now. I was working with the data office at Sage to bring in some at scale training platform to train people on data. We'd made a decision. Like, I'd put forward a supplier that I'd used in the past and I used in my personal life, and I said, have a look at this, get yourself personal accounts, play with this. I think this is spot on. They agreed. We'd made a decision, and then someone in the data office filled in a form on their website and then said, oh, it's brilliant, we've got a meeting, let's all get together. We all got together in a meeting room, and then this poor young man joined the call and said, how many employees have you got, and have you got the budget to provide this solution for everybody? Is there anyone else that needs to be involved in the decision? What do you have any special needs from this solution? And have you got the right amount? Like, when are you planning to do this? Is this financial year, or are you planning for the next financial year? And then we walked out of the meeting, and the person from the data office said, what was that? And I said, oh, we just got banted. That was the sales development rep, and they've now updated the Salesforce record. And when they said that they were going to put us in touch with the solutions expert, that's the real salesperson that's going to talk us through various different options. So we were then delayed 2 weeks. We then had the meeting with the sales representative, like the solutions expert. The solutions expert said, oh, I guess you're thinking about these suppliers. And we're like, no, we're not thinking about those. We just want this. And so he'd actually introduced us to new competitors, even though we'd already made the selection. Like, we just wanted a validation conversation, but we were forced through the whole sales process because they didn't know that. And I think that's because we still think of marketing and sales as marketing is generating the initial interest. Sales helps the customer build the selection and validate the selection. And actually, marketing needs to be doing all of the selection stuff as well. And then when you recognize someone comes into that point where they're making a decision, that's the point that you want to make sure that they're talking to the salesperson as quickly as possible, and the salesperson knows exactly what stage they're at because they've seen what they've interacted with on your website and on third-party websites. And I think that's where the buyer behavior has changed, because there's more information available, and therefore the way we market to people needs to be different.
We've probably had that conversation over the years, Harry, where I've got a horrendous habit of selling when I'm already in the room. So you'll know this. You know who I am. You know what we do. And I'll still now and again on the call go, oh yeah, we specialised in this and this, and here if you need it. I know you know that I know that's the case, but it's horrific and it's overcomplicating a process as well too. And that can be translated in pitches, and it can be translated in marketing and B2B basically. And I've seen it before firsthand from our perspective, where we've just probably sold too many solutions where the first one's the simplest one. And then it's like, we just want a simple solution, and you've given it's too complex right now too. And you've opened the opportunity for competitors to go through the door, and that sounds like that's been the case too. So yeah, it's a great analogy. It'd be as simple as possible, really. Simpler the better. Moving swiftly on, we obviously needed to get to marketing mix modeling, my favorite topic. I wanted to really talk to you about this because I'm finding I think it's a really niche specialism within the analytics community, and I still don't think many people really outside of really understand what it is. For the conversations I have, apart from people doing econometric modeling and marketing science, or marketing mix model as it's called, and experiments are often talked about in these circles, in analytics circles. But how do you apply it in a B2B marketing strategy, for instance, in a real world environment?
Yeah, I think my thinking's changed on this a lot in the last 4 years. I wanted to build the kind of gold standard approach to modeling when I first joined Sage. And I think that was probably the wrong thing to do. If I look back on it now, I think the right thing to do, if you are selling to small businesses, econometrics makes a lot of sense, because you've got a high volume of data. You've got a high volume of sales, a high volume of SaaS lead churn, high volume of people coming to the website. That means that you've got enough data to be able to find the relationships. Ultimately, media mix modeling is about, right, okay, how confident are we that this correlation between media spend or media output or marketing output of some variety or another is driving the sales or the like interim conversions, the kind of whatever variable that you care about. How confident are we that this correlation shows a causal relationship? When you start moving up into the mid-market and to enterprise sales, there's a lot smaller amount of data. And I think in reality, you can get to a point where you can run good models on mid-market and even enterprise, but you're going to need to be looking at much more of the leading indicators, because that's where you've got higher volume. So the number of opportunities, the number of leads, those sort of things, you're going to be able to get reasonably strong relationships with. When you get down to sales, if you're not actually making that many sales every quarter, you're going to have a small amount of data. So you're going to have many years of data in order to get valid findings. And if you increase it that long, like, things change. Different channels work in different ways over time. Like, there was a time where Facebook was the only social network. Now there's loads of them. I think with the mid-market, that's where doing more experiments to start with would have been a better choice. So my personal choice was, okay, for the small business in the UK, for the mid-market in the US, and then combined model for Europe. I think in reality, it probably would have been better to bring in a model for the UK, got that really robust, spend a bit more time on that particular models, and then start introducing experiments about the things that we cared most about within the mid-market. So before bringing in econometrics. The other thing that I learned really a lot is I spent a lot of time working with the finance team and explaining how the methodologies worked so that they understood and trusted the data that we were presenting them. I didn't spend that time with the sales team. And that was a mistake because ultimately, if you're a salesperson, you count the number of opportunities. It's a counting business. You go, how many opportunities? How many did I close? Now, how many meetings did I have? You're counting stuff. And so when someone turns up and talks about models and talks about R values, you're like, yeah, whatever. I'm not interested in this. Just tell me, are you going to generate more opportunities next month? And so I think spending more time understanding that sales world, and it leads on to another issue, which is within B2B, if you've got a sales organization and a sales team, it's very difficult to look at marketing effectiveness without looking at sales effectiveness. And so really, I think that there's an opportunity in B2B to move from looking at marketing effectiveness and sales effectiveness separately to start looking at overall go-to-market effectiveness, because then you start building that alignment. So I've learned that it definitely does work. I think it's very important that one, you start thinking about the overall go-to-market, which ultimately is really, if you go down to the root definition of what marketing is, you're talking about, right, taking products to market. So looking at the overall go-to-market is important, but it then starts questioning where should the effectiveness team sit, because like sales organizations are not going to want the marketing operations team or the marketing effectiveness team sitting in marketing to tell them whether they're doing a good job or not, and vice versa. So you probably need to have that broken out in a separate operations team. It could sit within the finance team. It could sit within an operations team if that's a kind of revenue operations that's sitting separately from sales and marketing. But I think there is some interesting things that you can solve with organization design that takes some of the politics out of that.
I wanted to add as well, from my perspective, like with marketing mix modeling as well, it's trying to sound too controversial. It's not dying, but there certainly isn't that many new people coming into this industry anymore than there used to be. There is the graduate schemes and the sort of junior hire schemes. I think since COVID, I'm speaking to the same people, and I have been speaking to the same people for the last 5 years, and we very rarely get new people into industry. And I spend a hell of a lot of time, as you'll know, trying to convince individuals who are marketing science specialists that to stay into that career pathway and structure, not to become a AI engineer or a data scientist or a data engineer. Not dissuade them from that, but maybe just temper slightly and say, look, listen, you're one of a few hundred people in the UK that do what you do. Right? Within the data science space, the engineering space, you're going to be one of several thousand, if not more. And I know I think the industry's slightly, it's coming into my next question regarding AI as well too. I think there's fatigue with some of these methodologies and tools with the individuals that are actually practicing them, and they want more from marketing science, which brings me on to my next question. I'm not too sure if you agree with that, by the way, Harry.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen a change, but
it's difficult. I think ultimately, and this is something that I've learned maybe a slightly more difficult way, that my job title isn't VP of media mix modeling or even VP of marketing measurement. It's VP of investment and effectiveness. What I need to be thinking about is how has the work that the team and I have done made marketing more effective? If the goal is I want to make this more effective, what's the best way of doing that? Sometimes that will be media mix modeling. Sometimes it will be designing an experiment. Sometimes it will just be listening to what people are doing, presenting it back to them and saying, hey, why don't you do some less batshit crazy stuff and do some more consistent, normal work? Like if you're thinking about how do I make the marketing more effective, having the right toolbox, like media mix modeling is part of that toolbox, but it isn't necessarily the only tool. And so I think kind of and you hear this from the agencies that quite often what I would consider a media mix modeling agency will now call themselves a marketing effectiveness agency. They're trying to push that, but and I think this comes on to AI. Should I just jump straight into AI? That actually, if the goal is right, like my job is to make marketing more effective, and I've got a whole bunch of tools to use that. Some of those are going to be AI tools. Some of those are going to be traditional statistical tools like media mix modeling. Some of those might be just designing experiments, very simple, test and control. That's often the gold standard of data. Some of that is just basic reports. No, there's lots of different, you need to then think, my job is to make things more effective. What tools do I use? And I think that's very much, if we have that mindset, if we look for people that want to work in that way, then we don't necessarily pin them down as you're a media mix modeler or you design experiments. And then you get away from, because one of the things that I find most frustrating is when you see a debrief and you spend the first 20 minutes talking about the methodology. Tell me what the answer is, what your recommendations are, and then if I'm questioning why you've come to those, then go into the methodology.
Again, yeah, I think a multifaceted approach for individuals to, not just teams, but for individuals to develop their career and utilize a variety of tool sets to keep them sane is a big benefit as well. Because if you're just doing it all day, if you're having a conversation with me, the last thing you want me to do is say, "Oh, I've got this other market effectiveness consultancy that specializes in it," and I get the eye roll, and I'm like, "Okay, I get it." So it's trying to find organize, and this is what Sage have done really well with your team, is that you eloquently put there, you enable people to become not generalists, but be able to be specialists in certain areas, and not just pigeonhole them with one specific tool set. I think that's what's happened in the market recently, especially in the agency world, and it is changing to the benefit as well too. Just quickly moving into AI then, is there anything within AI that you feel will influence marketing effectiveness in a B2B environment that's maybe out right now or might be coming in the future?
So I think if I think about what takes the most amount of time in every bit of measurement project, is getting the data in the first place. That's just the most painful thing. And moving from like a kind of cloud native tech company like Google, where actually if I wanted the data, all I needed to do is write a brief SQL query. And like I suspect if I was still working there now, I would just type, I want this data into an interface and it would just appear. But in the real world, there's multiple different systems. Getting those systems talking to each other in order to generate the data and making sure that data is comparable is the thing that we spend most of our time doing. It's really boring, getting and cleaning data. And I suspect that the thing that will make marketing more effective fastest is getting rid of that problem. Like, we were talking about a particular project that we wanted to do some very specific reporting on a specific product. Doing it the traditional way, we were looking at about a year's project in order to get that information into the right dashboards, cleaned up in the right way, and put into production. We think we'll be able to do it in about 12 weeks now, with using agents to collect and clean data and merge it together. And we'll bring in more data sources than we would have been able to do if we did it in the traditional way. So I think that's going to have the fastest impact. There's crazy stuff that you can do with creative. I'm not really an expert in that, but I think that probably there will be a lot of cost reduction. If I think about, we spend a bit of time coming up with an idea and turning that into a hero piece of content, and then we spend a huge amount of money doing all the adaptations to different languages, different countries, different formats. I reckon all of that adaptation time and cost will be minimized with AI. So I think you'll get a lot of cost savings that do that sort of thing. And then you'll get a whole load of getting the data into the hands of people making decisions faster. That's going to make that. And then at some point, piecing all of those things together so that you have an entire end-to-end system doing stuff. You just need to Google it, or should I say chat GPT it, and look for videos where people have got sales development reps and they're actually AI sales development reps. And you could think, okay, we don't want to do that with all of our high value opportunities, but maybe all of that stuff that previously was scored very low and you just put into some kind of nurture program, maybe actually you can get an AI SDR to do that conversation instead, working out, do you replace a current task or do you have to invent a new thing? And I think some of the AI native companies are inventing new things, and that's quite interesting. That's a bit wobbly.
No, I'm really hoping to see like how it does actually advance the industry in that space, and specifically in the hands of the professionals I deal with as well too. And I think it will be for a benefit. There's a lot of conjecture now and again around being guesswork, and we both know that isn't the case at all. It's usually people in different data disciplines don't really understand the effectiveness of it, no pun intended. But I feel like it's only going to enhance the industry and the market. But time will tell. I'm sure there'll be a new fancy tool popping up any day, any minute, any second. But just finishing off, Harry, really appreciate the insight so far. I want to finish off and wrap up. Is there any one piece of advice that you would give to B2B marketeers who are listening that might want to measure and improve effectiveness specifically right now?
So the mistake I made is I tried to boil the ocean. Like I had a vision for all the data in one place, everybody being able to pull everything they needed, using econometrics across the globe on that, getting that insight, using experiments where there were big changes being recommended from the econometrics, and then building out an attribution model that kind of does everything. I think if I was going to give people advice, is go and talk to all of the different marketers and find out what their challenges are, like what the frontline marketers, not the CMO. You need to understand their needs, but also find out what is the front line doing and what are they struggling with on making decisions. Where are they using their gut instead of using data, and solve some of those problems first. Like really focus on, okay, you ran this campaign last quarter. These were the results from it. Try this and this to see whether you can improve it. And so instead of taking a macro approach to effectiveness, I would say take a micro approach. Really go in and find out, like spend a month, 2 months talking to the marketers, finding out what they're doing on a daily basis, how they're making decisions about what campaign to run and what campaign not to run, where they see the problems, and fix some of those things. Because that way, one, you get good results fast, and two, you start to understand how the business is really working as opposed to how the managers or the leadership think it's working. And then it's very difficult to make a concept effective if the execution is different from that concept. And so find out what people are actually doing and how you can then improve what they're doing, auditing exactly what's going on, working out where the biggest blockers are and fixing those first.
That's great advice. If I was in marketing, I'd take it. Unfortunately, I'm in sales, so probably ignore you. But no, like really appreciate your insight here. It's a full overview, really good comprehensive overview of not just data but marketing, sales, and the enablement process, the integrations, and some of your examples and challenges there too were fantastic. So I really appreciate it. Where could people find you if they want to get in touch?
LinkedIn, I guess that's probably the easiest place. I don't do any real social media other than LinkedIn. I think I might have an Instagram account, but you're more likely to see mountains than anything about marketing effectiveness on that. But yeah, LinkedIn. And then hopefully I've got some articles coming out in the Drum about some of this stuff as well. So hopefully people will be able to see that soon as well.
Definitely. We'll put a link in the description if it's out before then and add it. But yeah, fantastic, man. Thanks again for your time, Harry. And hope to catch up with you soon.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Cheers.